Hello everyone, this is Miles Ezilo, back again for the Monumental Project on behalf of the Monuments Toolkit and World Heritage USA. In this episode, we will once again delve into the issue of controversial monuments, specifically looking at their impact on our cities and communities. Join us as we examine the future of urban planning and how it relates to these contentious structures. Let's dive in. Urban planning has been a hot topic in recent years, with the world's cities experiencing rapid growth and transformation. As population surge and infrastructure struggles to keep up, urban planners face a myriad of challenges. One such challenge is how to reconcile the need for progress with the preservation of our cultural heritage. This issue is especially pronounced when it comes to monuments that have come under scrutiny for their controversial histories. Many of these structures, from the Confederate memorials in the South to statues of colonial figures out west and on the East Coast, have become flashpoints for social instability. For many, they are a bitter reminder of past atrocities, as well as a celebration of authoritarian systems. Others see them as emblems of cultural heritage and testaments to their forefathers' achievements. How do we reconcile these opposed points of view? And what role do urban planners play in this debate? As cities continue to evolve, their planning strategies must do the same. Urban planners have a critical role to play in shaping our cities and ensuring that they are inclusive and equitable for all. This includes addressing the issues of controversial monuments and their impact on public spaces. Whether through the removal, relocation, or recontextualization of these structures, urban planners must find a way to strike a balance between preservation and progress. To speak to that, we sat down with Matthew Clark from the Design Trust for Public Space. Matthew Clark joined the Design Trust in May of 2020 as Executive Director, where he advocates for the power of public space to build vibrant, equitable communities. As an architect, planner, and writer, he has created complex architectural and urban design projects, developed public space policies, and developed national partnerships and initiatives. Prior to leading the Design Trust, Matthew was a National Director of Creative Placemaking at the Trust for Public Land, where he authored the Field Guide for Creative Placemaking and Parks. He has also held positions at Shop Architects and New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs. The Monumental Project spoke with Matthew about how to shape cities for the future, how controversial monuments affect the average citizen, and the importance of a city that reflects the people within it. Enjoy. Matthew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I cannot complain. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. It means a lot to us. And yeah, let's get started.
Great.
So if you could please give a brief introduction to yourself and the work you do.
Absolutely. My name is Matthew Clark, Executive Director of the Design Trust for Public Space. Myself, a little bit trained as an architect, planner, policymaker. I've worked in government, in private sector, public sector, so a range of experiences, but really thrilled to be part of the Design Trust for Public Space, which is an organization that unlocks the potential of public space. We've been around for about 28 years. We are focused on New York City, on issues that range from public space, but very much broadly affect all parts of our built environment. We have a unique model that's been a pretty constant over that organizational history, which is really centered on open calls for projects and ideas. We have a project-based model in our work. We focus on ideas or challenges that are important for the city. We source those very openly and transparently. We like to build teams that are very inclusive, cross-disciplinary. This includes fellows and other partners who all come to the table together to understand the issue, to research it. Ultimately, that always hopefully leads to some kind of pilot or test in the real world to understand something. And then hopefully at the end, we use that information, we use that consensus to create a change in a system or a policy, a regulation, a funding stream, a new coalition that can take that to scale so that they can impact every New Yorker. Happy to talk a little bit about examples of that. I'm sure we'll get into that in just a minute.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I guess urban planning and community development are career fields that many don't even know about, let alone settle into the way that you have. What was the path to get to where you are? Did your upbringing play a role in your career path, or was this an interest that you really didn't foresee?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I like to say and some people might disagree with this, is that urban planning is not really a discipline or a field. It's a set of many different kinds of expertise, all
Mm,
of which are important. And I think it's great that we're seeing, I think, people who are starting out increasingly thinking about, I want to impact the city.
right.
Planning is one lens that has a set of expertise that goes along with that, but frankly, there's dozens and hundreds of ways to impact the city based on the things that you're passionate about and one's background. For myself, I'm trained as an architect,
Hmm.
which I still identify as that. But I started out very early on. I think I knew when I was like in middle school, I want to be an architect, probably for the reason that it combined the creative and the analytical kind of dual brain approach was very
Right, right.
very appealing, but I also liked places. Places are so fascinating. They have embedded sense of history and purpose and intrigue and interest. Um, and so I early on, I went to undergrad for architecture. I practiced as an architect for some time. But probably in college at the same time, I was part of a humanities program that was very much about education in context in situ. I grew up in Kentucky, in a town of about 300,000 people. That's just big enough to have all of the complexities and systems and scales and intersections that make up a city, but also small enough that you could call the mayor or this person and learn about what they were doing and understand that.
Right.
That program really helped me understand that place is really fascinating and matters. I actually did my thesis project there on a public housing complex. That was one of the first public housing units in the country. Very interesting history. It was being torn down
Hmm.
for a Hope Six project, and I wanted to kind of understand both the reasons behind that, but also then the stories that came from that. And I think that really sparked something in me that I wanted to work at that kind of call that bigger scale, which is maybe the more kind of social and human scale.
Right.
So after practicing for a bit, which I really enjoyed, I went to grad school and did a degree in policy and planning. In addition to architecture, I worked for Mayor Bloomberg in cultural affairs
Hmm.
after that, and I really enjoyed that experience, which really probably more than anything else helped me understand how New York works and its systems and its politics.
Yeah.
From there, I've had a number of experiences that have ranged from private sector design firms to large national nonprofits to now being into kind of design trust, which is really kind of a nice marriage of a lot of my interests. New York focused policy and politics, design. So it's been a really nice kind of sweet spot. And I think that's really true with the planning field in general, is that there are young people I know and I've seen finding that sweet spot has been really, it's an interesting process to watch, because there's jobs that are incredibly analytical and data driven,
Hmm.
and there's jobs that are incredibly human centric around engagement. And there's a whole spectrum of opportunities for people who care about places.
Wow. You said that the one of the oldest public housing projects is in Kentucky.
It was in Kentucky. This is a little bit of a nuanced history, but the federal government used to be a big investor in public housing. It still is in some extents, but investor and builder of public housing. The first one was a kind of a trial experiment in 1933 with, I think, a dozen or so, maybe even less, sites around the country. I know there's one in New Orleans,
Hmm.
Lexington. And it was kind of during a movement of both city beautiful and city health, and also kind of New Deal politics that said the federal government needed to step in and fill a lot of needs. There was this movement called the Hauser movement that was kind of taking place. And a lot of planners were looking to Europe, which had really incredible models of social housing.
Hmm.
And so a lot of like Dutch models. And so those were piloted in those 12 places. And that was 4 years before the first federal housing legislation that came in 1937, if I remember my dates. That really was the first kind of true expanded public housing effort by the country.
Hmm.
There was another big bill in 49. That bill built most of the public housing, which probably most of us think about. The kind of images of public housing as towers in the park kind of model. That's where that construction mostly came from. And then starting in the 70s, the whole public housing infrastructure of the federal government shifted from building and maintaining public housing to vouchers and other private incentives to support housing, which there's a lot of critics of, some supporters of. It's a whole different podcast, but yeah, a little history about that.
It's funny you mentioned Kentucky and the city grew up in being like a mixture of like a modern city, but also accessibility. I found that really interesting. We're definitely going to get into that a little bit later. But to start, the work of World Heritage USA is heavily focused on monuments that glorify individuals and groups that no longer embody what America aspires to be. White supremacy, myths about the Civil War, so on, things like that. Did you come across any of this iconography in your hometown as a child, or was it a topic that was overlooked until later?
Yeah, it's absolutely. And actually there's I think I would celebrate and commend the leaders of Lexington who had a really thoughtful process of removing a Confederate monument in the basic courthouse square. It was never something I really thought about. Probably maybe I had an embedded sense of like, who's this person? But you just, if you're from whatever my position, I didn't maybe understand as a child, but much more so in college. We actually had a course, a wonderful course about monuments and memorials, and talked about the kind of global history of what it means to both memorialize as a process to create a monument. They're both verbs and nouns, and looking at how those have been tools of power, of persuasion, of cultural power in a way. And that's especially true here in the U.S. with, as you mentioned, our reckoning around race that this country has been dealing with for hundreds of years, and more poignantly, I think recently with some of the monuments. But Lexington had a really good process. Maybe good is the wrong term, but I think it did so in an open and engaged way. There was conversations, but at I think no moment was there any kind of doubt it needed to be dealt with, and it moved forward and was done. I think the statue was moved to a cemetery and to a place actually where it kind of made more historical sense. If I'm not mistaken there, but there's some great write-ups about that, and I think that was very much contrasting with some of the other municipalities that have either had much more challenging, riotous removal process, or places that haven't removed them yet. I mean, there's still plenty of places. I was in Bentonville, Arkansas, the home of Walmart, and there's a very prominent, Confederate statue there, which I found a little shocking given how actually progressive Walmart is in a lot of ways. But yeah, it was a really interesting story to watch that. I think it was handled fairly well there. But I remember as a child, you kind of question, like, is this something that you are, there's this implicit sense of understanding of, yeah, there's a statue of this person who's historical, but then do you have the armature to kind of think about it in different ways based on who you are and based on your empathy, understanding how someone else might perceive that. And that was probably something I didn't appreciate until more of an adult in college and later.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely something from most of the people that I've spoken to about this. It's a background topic that, once it comes to the forefront of conversation, you realize how much of it might have been affected in, your upbringing. It's like, oh, wow, that was there. Or, that's crazy how that came up. I wanted to shift towards the work that you guys are doing at the Design Trust. Incredibly important work for the state of New York. The mission of the organization is, and I quote, dedicated to the future of public spaces in New York City. That future aspect is interesting to me as someone who has established public space policies and urban design initiatives for the Design Trust and other organizations. What traits or characteristics do you look for in policy and planning that indicates that something is well suited for the times ahead, something that's future proof, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the answer is that probably is something that I shouldn't know. It's something that we should know. And I think that kind of gets to my answer a little bit, which is I think some of the best policies are those that have a very clear sense of their resilience over time.
Right.
Maybe I'll use that example. A question I always get in kind of interviews and stuff is around gentrification, right? That's something that we're all concerned about. Cities are always changing, right? Cities are not, people think about urban planning, you plan a city and then it happens, and that's not the way it works. Cities are a collection of forces of which many people are trying to to adjust in various kinds of ways, right? And
Mm.
the city is the collective expression of all of our decisions together. So, it's hard to plan, but one of the things that obviously many folks are concerned about is gentrification. In New York, it's obviously explicitly something that's based on race and class. Neighborhoods are changing. And I get a lot of questions, well, how do you think about policies to overcome that or to preempt that? And there's you could talk about a number of those things about housing development, housing vouchers, support for local businesses. There's a lot of things that are great. Those are all strong policies. To me, though, for the example of gentrification, I often talk about the role of really strong civic systems, civic organizations, people power in places. We hear a lot of stories about gentrification, but we hear less stories because there are less, but they are there. Of places that have actually managed to either not gentrify or to change in a way that's about building equity and power for people who are there and kind of in powerful ways. And so, to me, policies that are thinking about those people systems as equally as they are thinking about physical systems, whether that's infrastructure or roads or buildings or whatever that might be.
Interesting.
So how are you investing in people in a way that in 10, 20 years, 50 years, when we have no idea perhaps what new challenge might emerge, there is that resilience in social systems that can adapt over time. Maybe another example is around like business improvement districts, or other kind of civic organizations like that. How do you create entities that are responsive and resilient to places that then might be able to create a program that you didn't even imagine 10 years, 20 years down the line. So that's maybe one thing. I think similarly, during a process of creating or thinking about a policy, was that done through an inclusive process as possible? Was it engaged? And oftentimes policies or programs or projects are, they're dreamed up, imagined, designed, and then you go out to an affected community and say, what do you think? And that's kind of too late. And so as opposed to, let's start from the beginning, who's going to be impacted by this or who's at the table, and let's start to have a conversation about what matters. Oftentimes that can radically shift what a policy is. We're actually doing something right now about that. It's can't get into it too much, but it's about kind of changing some of the city design review processes. And there were some things that were done just very quickly because they kind of needed to be, but without a lot of people at the table, and that became a big backlash. And instead of saying let's start to open that up to as many people as possible, in a very inclusive way, outward thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. It's funny you talked about inclusivity. I think that leads us really well into our next question. So it's, speaking of the future in a way, I wanted to hear your thoughts on, technology in the city planning space. I think in decades prior, it was a bit easier to make changes or adjustments to a city and have little pushback, outside of protesting the big problematic changes. A lot of people simply just accepted things as they happen, but nowadays with social media and the desire for transparency in our institutions, it's become a lot easier to speak to your city planner or voice your opinion on a new development in your neighborhood. You talked about your experience in Lexington and being able to, possibly call up the mayor on something. Has this shift, in your opinion, made urban planning easier or more difficult?
Yes. Listen, I think like every facet of society right now, it's important to recognize we are in a profound moment of how technology is and has the potential to restructure our social and political systems. Right. We've already seen that. Cities are political entities. And I don't mean that by they are a government. I mean that the sense that cities are systems driven by a polity, a group of people who make decisions. And the way in which we're doing that in this country and elsewhere is at risk. And I think they can, of course, go both ways. And I don't want to be a Luddite and just say, we need to go back to the old town halls where we all sit in a room together and talk things out. But recognize that from a risk, we're losing places and means by which human relationships can develop into the kinds of social bonds we need to make decisions about each other. Because cities are all about compromise, right? There's no good for every single person. In every instance of decision making about the cities, you're talking about compromise. Like I got to be taxed. I got to take some of my money to build roads, or we have to take the prison initiative at Rikers Island. That the plan was to build 5 prisons around the community. Those are difficult trade-offs. Right. But this kind of goes back to my earlier comments. If you don't have a sense of a collective importance, a care for each other, and to know that it's both a give and a take, and I say that knowing in context to how racism has played a part in that and continues to play a part in that for kind of a white supremacist society. There's more give on that end. I should admit, but at the same time, it's a complicated system, and we want to build something where we can robustly understand each other on a human level so that we can make those compromises. Yeah. And I think social media delimits our ability to do that. It reduces our kind of connection to each other beyond one perspective or one understanding. Yeah. And so you're seeing actually a lot of people think about new ways to bring people to the table around civic engagement and to use technology for stronger purposes. There's a lot of calls for things like, libraries and parks and public spaces, these kind of like civic anchors, which can bring us together, the need for that. At the same time, there's also technology and systems that are going to be dramatically reordering our experience of city. Augmented reality. There are things happening in the tech space. I'm actually part of a working group that's actually looking at some of the technology that are being developed. There are things out there that are coming in the pipeline that we don't even imagine yet. And how does augmented reality, for example, affect our city? Are people going to be having 2 different kinds of experiences in the same public space? Are companies going to be monetizing their public space? You think about Pokemon Go or whatever that was. That's kind of a simple example of that, but right, that's a company using the cityscape. So that's that AI, any number of things are going to be really changing the way we think about cities pretty dramatically. And I don't think we're prepared as planners to regulate that, to understand that, to know how to manage that. It's a double-edged sword. I think we are not going to, it's technology and its growth are going to be part of city making, but I think we need to be able to reckon with that collectively about who's going to be impacted by that work.
We spoke to an amazing artist named Meredith Bergman, who made a sculpture of women's rights leaders in Central Park. She spoke about the tedious process of getting that piece together, figuring out which patch of land is allowed, where it to be located, depending on other projects, future projects, etc. It was a lot, and that was just for one statue in Central Park. When it comes to building communities we live in and the public spaces we occupy, what processes have to happen that most people might not know about? Things that could slow down a project or possibly limit the impact you'd like it to have.
Yeah. It's funny, though. I think it's easier to plan a district than to put a sculpture in Central Park. I actually think that's the case. And I'm only half kidding in some ways. And I think it kind of goes to the theme of this podcast, which is about monuments and memorials, which are, we vest them some of our most important ideas and memories as culture. So it makes sense. But at the same time, I think, as you say, our neighborhoods are also expressions of who we are. There's, maybe I'll speak a little bit generally, because particularly in New York, which is a largely developed city, that's not expanding. Let's say, Denver is a good example of a city that's growing at a district level, district scale, right? Yeah. We in New York do things a little bit differently because we're largely built out, and the way we control how changes are made largely is through zoning. There's very rarely an instance where you have a district or something that's bigger than a block or even a building and you have someone or someone laying it out and designing it. That's not really the case. There's quite a number of examples of block level development, but zoning is probably the biggest tool that New York uses to change places, and to develop neighborhoods. In New York, it goes through a process called ULURP, which is a universal land use review process, which is a prescribed set of steps that need to happen to change the zoning of a neighborhood. Zoning is a process that controls both the use of what happens in buildings, or can be built, residential, commercial, industrial, et cetera, but also controls the form that buildings take too. Actually, New York invented zoning back in 1919. That might be 2 years off. But as Lower Manhattan was developing, there was developers who were building taller and taller buildings, and they would go to the very block edge and go straight up. So as you were walking the sidewalk, it just felt like night because there was no light getting to you. And so the city realized that they needed to think about a policy to actually control how buildings were shaped. So the first zoning laws were passed here, and now they're almost universally used elsewhere to do the same thing. We can change zoning a number of ways. Private developers who, let's say, own property can apply for variances at a building or even a district level. And the city can also proactively change things too, which has happened very recently. The previous administration went through quite a few neighborhoods and did some rezoning processes. There's rezonings happening all over the place. In Gowanus, if you know that neighborhood in Brooklyn, zoning was just passed there last year, which is going to dramatically change that neighborhood around the Superfund site. So as I said, that ULURP process, that land use review process, has some required steps. There's community engagement along the way, which is very prescribed. New York, as does a lot of places, requires environmental review and environmental impact statements, EIS statement, kind of planning lingo, which basically whoever's the actor, the private sector actor, whoever is the property owner or developer, is required to understand the impacts of a development on a neighborhood. So is it going to impact wildlife? Will stormwater impact the development? Will there be noise, et cetera? And then through that zoning, you really actually have a lot of power to shape how that in use looks like. So everything from the kinds of businesses that can occupy ground floor retail to where is their residential and commercial in very prescribed ways. That can be done through that ULURP process. And as I said, that can be done before you have a master plan. So that can be done by a city who says, hey, we need more housing in this area because there's also a lot of transit access here. So it's a perfect area to rezone and expand. Sometimes it happens because a developer, they've owned 3 blocks and they've done a master plan and they want to build that, but they can't do it in what's called as of right, or basically as the current laws allow. So they go through a process of rezoning. So in New York, that's kind of typically what you most see in terms of kind of neighborhood change. But I will say it's very different across the country and how that happens as well.
Wow. Thank you. Definitely a whole lot of information. So a lot does go into building a city, building a community that a lot of people just don't know about. Thank you for that.
Just quickly too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing we're reckoning with in New York and a lot of places is it too much actually? You think about one of the real challenges of cities right now, it's housing, obviously housing instability. Are there too many barriers to actually building? And it's a very contentious question. Building means communities change, but if people can't afford, homes for their families, is that fundamentally wrong itself too? So I think right now there's a lot of reckoning with how can we reduce those barriers, but at the same time preserve an ability to change communities in a way that communities want to be changed. And so it's a real tension that there's not a great answer.
Interesting. The reflection between the community and the city, I think, is such an interesting point. We're actually going to cover that a little bit later. But this brings me to the work of the Monuments Toolkit, specifically art that depicts outdated ideologies and creates objects of, like you said, contention in a community. Statues that stir up emotions that lead to things like protests and rallies against these figures. In your restorative city project, which I find really interesting, you asked the question, how can neighborhood design improve mental health? And I think the conversation on monuments relates to this directly. Speak a little on restorative city, if you could, and how does the design of a city and the pieces within it affect the well-being of citizens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something that a lot of people don't maybe connect as much. So as I mentioned, I'm by training an architect and planner, and oftentimes, our training as a student, we talk about stuff, buildings, streets, systems, cities, yada yada. We love that stuff. It's cool. It's very interesting. But ultimately, what sometimes has been received less focus is who are the end users of that? Who are the people ultimately that are impacted by that? And I've had the benefit of doing some work with public health people, some national organizations, some local organizations. And one of the things that was really profound is that the way public health people are looking at it, or looking at their work, is with a very direct understanding that our environment, the world around us, our social connections are the biggest drivers actually of our health outcomes. And it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Doesn't healthcare? And when you really measure it, 80% of our health outcomes come from, as I said, what is known as the social determinants of health. So the world around us, access to jobs, housing, clean air, arts and culture, social connections, those kinds of things, and not our individual lifestyle choices and access to healthcare. Those last two are only 20% of our health outcomes. So it's basically, it's saying that as a planner, maybe a planner is actually a public health professional. That makes sense.
Wow, yeah.
But that brings with it a lot of other kind of questions and expertise. It also then brings up another kind of top line thing that surrounds all of that. So if these things make us healthy, if having good housing, if having transportation, clean air make us healthy, well, who decides what those things are, right? Why is there dirty air, lack of housing, lack of fresh food in South Bronx, and the opposite, 2 miles south in the Upper East Side? Someone made decisions at some point to be the case. And in America, racism actually is kind of the thing that is fundamental to some of that decision making. And so what's interesting is a lot of health departments have named racism as kind of the top line public health issue in this country.
Wow.
And that wraps into obviously a lot of things, but the reason why neighborhoods are different can really largely be traced to a history of exclusionary policies, redlining, exclusionary zoning, et cetera, that has existed and continues to exist today. And so there's kind of two calls to action there. One, as planners, we need to be thinking about health as an outcome in our work. Does decisions we make about our world lead to community and collective and individual health and well-being? And then secondly, who's at the table? How are those outcomes distributed? How are they unequally distributed now? And how can actions be taken to make some restorative actions in that case? So if that makes sense, there's both the leaning into health and then really understanding those disparities of health. So the initiative is really kind of focused on making that connection primarily to planners and architects, because I think public health people are very on board. They're like, yeah, we know, we're housing experts, we're food experts, we're infrastructure experts. We know that these things matter. I think planners are slowly recognizing actually that health and inequities are something that should be in our lexicon just as much. So yeah.
Interesting. Wow. I am curious. It says that the Design Trust for Public Space has a unique model, working between so many different facets of institutions like, the private sector and the government and that nature. You talked about the social, justice element that plays a role in public development and urban development. Do you sometimes have to cloak that social justice piece in, I don't know, maybe a bottom line or something when you speak to the private sector, you speak to the government of that nature? Or is it something that you're usually on board with?
I think this is based on my experience in New York, right? Like, listen, New York City Council has a strong progressive caucus. City agencies, even if they're big and complicated entities,
Hmm.
they've largely bought in. Like,
Okay.
it's not in this place. Again, I mentioned, like, I'm from Kentucky in the South, and that's a different story, right? That's a
Right.
different story. Um, it's not so much that it has to be hidden. It's often that the the things that we need to do to maybe address that are hard to do with the systems that exist. So, like,
Mm.
even if you have a very thoughtful partnership and a really great city agency partner, and they're like, yeah, I'm in line with your mission. I want to, which often is the case. They are incredible people. It could be sometimes that it's just hard to take action on that. For example, this is not a design trust, but this is some experience I had in previously. Um, we were working with, this was a kind of a national land conservation and parks organization, working with water utilities, which sounds a little dull,
Hmm.
but if you think about places like Flint or otherwise, where water issues are frankly one of the most important things that make cities successful. The reason, this is kind of an aside, kind of a nerdy aside, but the reason New York is New York is because it has great water access,
Mm.
both formerly the Hudson, but also it owns thousands and thousands of acres upstate that feed water, clean water to the city, and it's plentiful. Places like LA and Phoenix have much different stories. And then some places, and again, this goes back to the racism, places have water that is poisoning their people. Likely not from some ill purpose, but because people weren't investing in those systems.
Right.
Um, so anyways, back on this side, in working with those water utilities and water quality districts, a lot of them really were like, hey, we want to think how we engage residents in some of the work we're doing, right? It's really important for people and want them to know about it. We want to do community engagement differently. One thing we were working on them with is doing more public art, right? There's a lot of infrastructure dollars in water as you're doing these major utility projects, but you dig out pipes and build new ones and, hey, build parks and put public art and engage people.
Hmm.
The problem was the dollars that they had to spend were so restricted based on a bond or based on something else that, even though this $1 billion project had this much money, you couldn't spend 100,000 on a piece of public art that would have been so meaningful,
Mm.
to memorialize something, for example, for some of your themes. So, you have to be like, okay, maybe we could use some of our communication budget. So, examples like that often, for at least progressive cities that have a strong justice perspective, and New York definitely does in most respects. It often comes down to how do you think about inserting that into these systems or these budgets or these programs that have a lot of momentum and a lot of urgency behind them, but
Mm.
maybe are not used to being flexible. And that's actually a lot of what we do, is helping city agencies be flexible and creative in ways they sometimes can't be.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like stretching them out to find the holes to make things happen. That's really,
Yeah,
really
and
fascinating
just to be
stuff.
clear too, they want to. Most of them want to do this. Like, they're eager to do that, and they want to kind of break free of all the bureaucracy and things they have to adhere to. And so, that's just to celebrate. I think there's a lot of good people in government, even though sometimes government could get in their own way.
Mm. It's actually great that you brought up public art. I think it's such an interesting topic, and I think there's a fascinating connection between public art and the community that surrounds it. We've talked to a few artists about it, particularly muralists, about the concept of authentic depiction, and how it always seems to be a major point in their work. This is a major reason why contentious monuments are an issue, because they don't represent anyone they're standing above, so to speak.
Mhm.
Another project I admired was Turnout NYC, another project of yours, which supported New York City-based artists and other
Yeah.
cultural organizations while providing access to the arts throughout the city. In your mind, how vital is it that the art surrounding the community reflects that community itself?
It's almost an oxymoron to say you couldn't. Our arts and culture is one of the purest expressions of who we are, and if it doesn't do that, then it's not. It's almost like it's not arts and culture in a way. Like,
Mm.
it's truly one of the most pure expressions of who we are. And that was kind of why I was mentioning that joke about, the sculpture at Central Park, about how sometimes tough that can be. It's because arts cuts through to who we are as with an individual and a community, that it can be so personal, right? It's a double-edged sword. It's something that gets to our most fundamental human self. And the joke with like all the AI stuff, I like to say sometimes, is that the last job any of us will have before technology takes over is a poet. It's the last human job that'll exist, because it's the last thing that is the most human expression of, and that's probably true for musicians or dance, but I really truly believe that the arts are the way in which we express ourselves as individuals.
Right.
A lot of people in communities think, no, I'm not an artist, I can't do that. But that's totally bunk. We're all creative, we're all expressive, and we all participate in that too. And I think that's really, really critical. So for us, for turnout, we had a lot of interesting decisions to make there. This was a project where we actually worked with a partner called Situ design firm, who we created kind of outdoor arts infrastructure. And then we worked with community partner organizations to put that in public space. We gave them some resources with the goal of artists who lived in a neighborhood or place and didn't have access to a place to perform, which are largely centered in kind of Manhattan and a little bit inaccessible for a lot of reasons. So giving them a platform to meet the public, and for the public to meet artists in their community and of their community. Because I think arts and culture, that representational question, it's not about the end product. The end product's too late. How do you design a really great process? There's some wonderful mural organizations all over the country that do mural painting, not to get to the final, here's the painting of the person or the thing that we want to represent, but as a process, as a verb, right? Making a mural is a community process, and that's where the transformation lies, is generating an idea, doing it together, working together. And I think that's what's so special about the arts, is that process in addition to the product.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I love what you said about it's almost being too late when the end result comes out, if you haven't really considered the community around it. And I think that's why, although these monuments of controversy have been coming up and then taken down, we have the ability now to kind of start that process of looking for these monuments of upliftment in a positive light, and starting that, from the ground up. Like, okay, cool. Let me look at the community around me, and then let me build these pieces of representation, in honor of those people. So I think, yeah, like you said, the most purest form of ourself is arts and culture.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Can I give you an example, just a story
of course, yes.
a monument? And I don't have an answer to this. Now, this is at a previous organization. I'll say I won't say the park. I won't say the place, because there's some contention there. It was a neighborhood, largely Black neighborhood, with a lot of civil rights leaders who have a connection to that place. Very well organized, a lot of community support. And there was a park being developed, major park. It was funded by a lot of actually water quality. So they had funding to build the park, and a big consortium had gathered together. The city was involved. This was not New York City, was involved to build this park. And as part of that, the people who were doing it very rightfully were like, hey, we want you to think about the legacy of this neighborhood, and putting some monuments or memorials or something to capture that story, right? So the community had a pretty clear sense of who that wanted to be represented. This person and this person, that makes sense. And they had a really thoughtful process of imagining that. But then it came question of how to do so. And there was some elders in the community who paid for their own renderings to put these statues that almost look like big Corinthian columns, like 100 feet tall, with a statue on top.
Huh. And
said, here's how we want to do it, because we want it to be in the language of, what we've known as kind of a white dominant country who's used Greek and Roman architecture to tell its story. We want to take that and say, this is our legacy. And there was a different contingent, both community based, maybe is a fair way to put it, who was like, that's ridiculous. It looks like fascist memorial from, World War II or something. And, these elders had a lot of history and sway, and they had some connection to these people. And so, I was part of the organization that was kind of helping to build. And so we were kind of facilitating, and it ended up those things were not being built. But it brought up an interesting question about, how powerful monuments and memorials are. I always think back to that one, and, about what it meant to think about the same people, the same representation in different ways. And I think ultimately the process worked out where there was a strong coalition that was built. That kind of goes back to that, like, if you have strong ties and trust, you can work through those things. And I think that's what happened. But it's a story that I always think about in terms of this, because even if you can say, hey, agree, these are the people we want to remember, there's still decisions about design, about how that come into play. There's the sense of history is challenging. It's not as simple as I think it's face value too.
Yeah, without a doubt. Art and history is what creates, these monuments that we look at. And I think both art and history have this element of depiction, right? You don't really know from person to person how they perceive art, how they perceive this history. So I think there's always so much room for interpretation. And when you have, a big group of a community trying to create one sort of idea or one representation of who they want to see standing above them all the time, it is always going to be a conversation. It's almost never cut and dry, at least from what I've gathered. So yeah, definitely interesting conversation. I know those kind of situations happen all across the country. Like I said, the Design Trust for Public Space is doing amazing work around New York. If you could please let people know about any upcoming events, seminars, initiatives, or anything else that the Design Trust has on schedule this year.
Yeah, if we have a great event coming up in a few weeks, if this comes out beforehand, called Restorative City at the Ford Foundation, looking at that kind of theme of restorative city. And then otherwise stay in touch with us on designtrust.org, social media. We will be having events this summer and this fall. Sign up for our newsletter online. We have some great content there about public space. And just stay in touch. It'd be great.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. It has been an amazing conversation, to say the least. This is our last question that we ask to all of our guests. We've asked activists, we've asked politicians, we've asked historians, we've asked artists. I'm interested to hear your opinion on it, given your background. How do we correctly address monuments of oppression, monuments that are in our space, monuments that are in our cities? What is the best way to handle them while still, I guess, preserving some sense of history, but also looking at everybody's well-being in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll go back to my kind of first prompt, which is build the tent, build the table together. The reason these are so contentious is because there is power embedded in them. And in order to either overcome and remove something that is oppressive, or to build something that is restorative, you need to have a table that trusts each other. And so I think maybe even before and tackling one of those things, build the community, build your network, reach across places where there was distrust and build trust. I think that's, the onus on that is something we all need to work on in different kinds of ways. But I think that table is really, really powerful. And a very quick example, working a project in a public housing site in the Lower East Side. We weren't planning to kind of memorialize a park we're helping to co-develop, but we had a really strong community design team. Someone part of that complex, kind of a maintenance staff, passed away. And I think naming it after that person kind of emerged as a really great idea. But that existed because that table was built, right? There was multiple voices who were able to hear each other and find that consensus. And I think that trust building, that can really be part of that process. And then once you build that trust and have that conversation about that monument memorial, it can also lead to other things too, talking about housing policy, talking about this, talking about that, which is going to lead to better places. So that's how important this conversation is.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. We'd like to thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the entire World Heritage USA team, and all of our listeners around the world for tuning in. Tune in next month as we talk to another leader in the historic preservation space. Also, if you enjoyed these conversations, we're going to be looking at these topics more in depth this summer in Charleston, South Carolina, San Diego, California, and Richmond, Virginia with our series Monumental Summer. Stay tuned and visit our website for more updates. As always, I'm Miles Azilo. Thank you.